All right, so now we're going to move on to section 41, right? This is the last section of module 5, and we're going to talk about recommendation systems. So I think the curriculum actually shows how to do recommendation systems in the labs using PySpark. I'm not really going to talk about that necessarily. Note that your code can be technically written in Python and other stuff. It didn't have to necessarily be in PySpark to be implemented. But since you guys already learned PySpark, hopefully in section 40, it's just kind of showing you how to apply that. Okay, so let's talk about recommendation systems in general. So loading. There we go. Okay, so for recommendation systems, this is a really classic problem. And basically is that what we want to do is predict basically based on some user information or whatever. Basically a user comes to your site. The classic is kind of like saying, what kind of movies does someone like? So Netflix actually figured this out quite a lot. If anyone remembers like Blockbuster or Hollywood Video, stuff like that, those rental sites, or not rental sites, rental like, physical locations where you can go in and rent a movie. They basically couldn't solve a problem. And one big problem is basically they could only, they couldn't serve every movie, right? So what kind of movies did they likely serve, if you guys remember or can probably reason? What was the most, what kind of movies would they hold? Because they couldn't hold every movie.
New releases or top box office sales.
Yeah, exactly, right? You basically get the most popular stuff and the new stuff, basically the things that most people would want to watch. And this is where things like Netflix actually became a really big deal, is that basically they started focusing on this thing called long tail and this very like ending part. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of long tail, but the idea here is that most people will kind of see like most people will be really popular on these very select movies. But then as you get kind of like on like other fringes of other movies, very few people actually enjoy those movies or care about those movies. But because there's so many more people and each person's kind of like has their own niche that they really like about, you end up actually having a lot of you can basically hit these huge amount of people over on the side here. So this is actually what long tail is. And that's actually one big reason why Netflix did really well when they started, if you remember before they did streaming, where they basically just mailed, DVDs to people. So kind of interesting, but there's actually a little motivation of saying, okay, recommendation systems are actually a huge deal now, is that essentially it's not about just getting the most popular things. It's about also finding like the exact thing that, like that you would really like to watch or you would like to listen or something like that. So think like Spotify or, Netflix's or, YouTube's video, or even just Google when you search for things, saying, what's the thing that you're really trying to find here? Okay. So we can actually use this information. The idea is here we can use some information to predict things. But like how do we do this? So this is where data scientists come in, right? So basically we can take this information and provide it, basically get a little bit better at just like guessing at what someone wants to listen to or watch. Okay. So here's a kind of quick question. How do you figure out what movie to recommend? So like when you're talking to someone, how do you recommend the movie to someone? What are some ways you could do it?
See what movies they've seen before.
Good, right? You can say, what kind of movies have you seen before? Like, what was the most recent movie you watched? And you can kind of get a feel for like what someone is, like what kind of movies, based on whatever movie they watched. You can say, oh, here's a similar movie to it. What are some other things you could do too? If someone said, oh, what movie should I watch?
What's popular?
Yeah, so say, hey, this is the most popular movie right now. Let's go see it. For example, like let's say when Avengers Endgame came out, everyone was like, let's go watch Avengers Endgame. I know a lot of like, people who have never watched like really Marvel movies and they're like, let's watch Avengers Endgame. You can probably imagine that like, it might have been a decent movie, but they probably were pretty lost too. So just having the popular movies might not be the most fruitful. Okay, and there's a third way we'll kind of talk about, but basically based on what the person itself, right? Saying like, what are their hopes and dreams, and like what kind of person are they? Are you a Sagittarius? Things like that. So first, I'm going to talk about the quote unquote the dumb way. But basically, it's like whatever's most popular, right? So like, yeah, Minions is super popular. You'll love Minions, right? And then everyone rolls their eyes like, not Minions. So this is commonly referred to like rank-based recommendation. And so I know the curriculum doesn't mention about rank-based, but basically the idea here is kind of obvious. It's like, oh, you basically say what's the most popular thing, what's the most watched thing, what's the most listened thing, Basically, what's the most popular on some metric, right? And use that as saying, okay, here you go. You can think of this also being like, oh, what's the most average, movie that most people would be fine with watching or something like that. Okay, so yeah, that's kind of like the basic idea. And you can probably guess, that's not really the best thing because everyone's like special in the sense of like what they want to watch and what they actually care about, right? And I just love this little dog because it takes forever to like realize he's right there. But anyway, basically everyone's a little bit different, right? So you want to see kind of like how, based on the user, right, based on the person, you might want to get some information. And there's a few ways we can do this. So we already mentioned a couple. So this is where we come into the smart way. So one really basic way, basically by knowing just anything about the person, can already give you a big information. For example, if they're an adult, they might like Minions, but maybe it's not, more geared towards like the younger side of things. So this is like knowledge based. Basically, you can start filtering out options saying, okay, like I know a little bit about your taste. Let me give you the most popular thing with that taste in mind. So like an example here is like, oh, you only like detective movies. Well, the most popular detective movie right now is Detective Pikachu. So that should be better. So that might be decent enough, but you can probably already see a little bit of issues in this. Like, well, it might not still be the best movie for that person, even if they just said, oh, I only want to watch, a certain genre. They still might not like the most popular thing, or, the popular one's fine, but it's not their most optimal suggestion. Okay, so a little bit smarter than just like saying whatever is most popular, but still can have not the best thing. Okay. So the next one is something called content-based. And so content-based, the way I kind of phrase this is like, if you like Iron Man, you'll like other Avenger movies. So the idea here is like, you say, okay, they've seen this movie or they like this movie. What are other movies that are like that? And recommend that to them. Okay, so here's a little graphic from the curriculum where this user right here likes this movie right here, and these movies are similar, so recommend that movie. Okay, so that's content-based, and that makes sense. It's based on the content of whatever they were looking at. Okay. And then our last one is collaborative filtering. So this one's kind of a fun one, and this is actually where a lot of the new, most recent stuff's coming through. And the idea here is we're using other users and what their interactions are with other movies or other, whatever they're interacting with, whatever items they're interacting with, and making those recommendations. So kind of like this little analogy here is like, oh, you like Megamind, which if you haven't seen Megamind, it's a great movie. But it's like, oh, you like this movie Megamind. Oh, you're just like my brother. You're just like this person. Like, I bet you'll like this movie too, since they like that movie. And this is actually really cool because this actually means that it's not based on the movie itself. So it's not that these movies are necessarily similar to each other. It just means that the people who like this movie tend to like this movie as well. So you can imagine this blue person right here saying, oh, we both like this movie, these two movies over here, and blue person likes this red movie right here. Well, then we should recommend that red movie to this person. And these, this blue, green, and red movies might be completely different from each other. But the idea here is that because they both like these things, this person is probably similar to this person. So we can recommend movies that they haven't seen yet. Okay. And that's collaborative filtering. All right. Sound good? Any questions between collaborative filtering, content, and knowledge base? Okay.